So what should you actually do if you live anywhere in the eastern half of the country? Treat fire risk like the Westerners you may have once pitied. Honor every burn ban, clear the flammable clutter from the immediate perimeter of your home, and know that in drought years, embers, dry grass, and a trailer chain sparking on asphalt have started disasters. If you are on a well, learn its depth and its history now, store some water, and get on a driller's radar before the failures around you fill the schedule. If you keep animals or crops, make your feed, water, and sell down decisions early. Because in a flash drought, the punished are always the ones who waited for the rain that the forecast never actually promised. And whoever you are, take your community's water restrictions seriously in July so they do not become water emergencies in October. None of this is fear. It is the basic literacy of a drier world, arriving in the last region that thought it was exempt. The Eastern United States is having its worst drought in more than 2 decades, and by the oldest records we have, one of the worst ever. But what makes it different is not a statistic. It is a boundary being erased. The old American map had 2 water worlds, a dry west that planned for scarcity and a wet east that never had to. And every farm, well, town and forest east of the Mississippi was built on the eastern side of that line. This is the year the line moved. Subscribe now if you want stories like this every week, told straight, with the real science and none of the hype. Drop a comment telling me what state you're in and what the drought looks like out your window, because those reports matter, and share this with someone who farms, ranches, or lives on a well in the east. They are the front line of this story. Before you go, one final thread, because buried inside this hard year is a genuine reason for hope, and it comes from the South's own history. Here is something almost nobody outside the fire world knows. The southeastern United States is, quietly, the prescribed fire capital of America. More deliberate, controlled, good fire is set across the South each year than in all the western states combined. A living inheritance of practices that indigenous peoples and rural southern communities maintained for centuries, burning the pine woods low and cool to clear the fuel before wildfire could claim it. The great longleaf pine ecosystems that once carpeted the coastal plain literally evolved with that rhythm of frequent, gentle fire. And where the tradition survives, this drought is meeting forests with far less fuel to feed on. That is the template, and it extends beyond fire. Farmers across the region are rediscovering the drought arts, deep-rooted cover crops, soil built to hold water like the sponge the sky has become, herds sized to the dry years rather than the wet ones. Towns are metering, storing, and planning, as if the next dry September is certain because it may be. The East cannot vote on whether its climate is changing. The records of 2026, the driest pages in a book that goes back to 1895, have already settled that. What it can decide, on 10 million individual pieces of land, is whether this drought is remembered as the disaster that caught a region sleeping or the alarm that finally woke it. The dry season isn't over. The decision season has just begun. Then there is one November night you need to know about. In the autumn of 2016, a drought, eerily similar to this one, gripped the southern Appalachians. Months of failed rain, record dryness, forests standing cured and brittle across Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Dozens of fires broke out across the mountains that fall, and smoke hung in Appalachian valleys for weeks. Then, in late November, a fire that had been creeping across a remote, rugged peak in the Great Smoky Mountains called Chimney Tops met a weather event no one adequately foresaw. A windstorm driving gusts to hurricane force down the mountain slopes, directly toward the resort town of Gatlinburg, Tennessee. What happened next unfolded faster than any evacuation plan. The wind threw embers miles ahead of the fire. Downed power lines ignited new fires across the town's flanks. And within hours, a beloved mountain vacation town in the green, wet east was burning from multiple directions at once. 14 people were killed. Roughly 2,500 homes and businesses were damaged or destroyed. 14,000 people fled through streets walled with flame down a mountain at night. It remains one of the deadliest wildfires in the modern history of the eastern United States, and the lesson of Gatlinburg was never that one town was unlucky. The lesson was a formula. Eastern drought plus eastern fuel plus one bad wind day equals a western-scale fire disaster. In a region with no defensible space culture, no fire-hardened building codes, and no muscle, memory for evacuation. Every ingredient of that formula except the wind is sitting in place across the southeast right now in July, with the driest, hottest stretch of the year still ahead and above normal temperatures in every forecast. That is not a prediction that a Gatlinburg will happen this year. It is a plain statement that the door to one is standing open. Which brings us to the forecast, and the twist that separates this drought from everyone before it. For generations, the East's droughts have carried an expiration date written in the tropics. When the land dried out, the region could wait on the Atlantic, because sooner or later a tropical storm or hurricane would wander ashore and dump, in a single weekend, the 10 or 15 inches of rain that months of ordinary weather could never deliver. Grim as it sounds, hurricanes have historically been the Southeast's drought. Breakers of last resort and meteorologists in the Carolinas have said openly that this drought, too, will likely require a tropical system to truly end. Here is the problem. While the drought was building, the Pacific Ocean flipped. The La Nina pattern that helped dry out the South has given way to a developing El Nino, forecast to persist through the winter, and El Nino is famous among forecasters for one signature effect. It tears apart Atlantic hurricanes before they mature, suppressing the very season the Southeast is depending on, while simultaneously tending to keep the region's autumn drier than normal. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the crux of everything. The climate system has arranged itself to withhold both the ordinary rains and the emergency rains at the same time. The drought breaker may not come. The scientists tracking this are careful with their words, but the words they choose, that relief is unlikely before late fall, that this could become a record drought, that recovery may stretch deep into next year, all point the same direction. For the land, the farms, and the fire season of the East, the worst months of 2026 are quite possibly still in front of us. Now, briefly, the noise, because it needs clearing. You will see claims online that this drought is engineered, that weather modification programs are stealing the rain. Cloud seeding is real, marginal, and utterly incapable of redirecting the storm tracks of a hemisphere. And the actual causes of this event, the La Nina winter, the ridging, the record low precipitation, are laid out publicly in the data of a dozen independent agencies. You will hear that a green landscape cannot truly burn. And Brantley County, Gatlinburg, and the smoldering peat of past eastern fire seasons answer that better than any argument. And you will hear, after every passing thunderstorm, that the drought is broken. It is not, and this is worth understanding. Because summer storms in the South are liars. They drench one field and skip the next county entirely. They run off hard-baked ground instead of soaking in. And against deficits that measure a foot or more of missing rain, an afternoon downpour is a rounding error. Droughts like this one end in seasons, not storms. Across the Southeast, pastures that should have greened up in March stayed brown into summer, and a brown pasture is not an aesthetic problem. It is a missing harvest, because grass is what a cattle operation actually grows. Ranchers began feeding winter hay in spring, then discovered the hay itself was scarce and its price climbing, because the hay fields had failed too. And when the feed runs out and the ponds shrink to cracked mud, a rancher faces the oldest, bitterest arithmetic in agriculture: sell the herd or watch it starve. Sale barns across drought country have been running long days as families liquidate breeding stock that took decades to build. And here is what that really means. A herd is not inventory. It is compounded time, generations of selection and care, and once it is sold, a rain next month does not bring it back. Row crop farmers face their own version. Seeds gambled into dust, corn curling in June, and the federal crop reports quietly downgrading fields week after week. And beneath the farms, literally beneath them, sits the other silent crisis. Millions of rural Eastern households drink from private wells, drilled to depths that made sense in a climate that no longer fully exists. As the water table falls, the shallowest wells fail first, and a failed well is not an inconvenience. It is a house without water in a heat wave, a family hauling jugs, a waiting list at the well driller's office that stretches for months. This is the anatomy of a drought in a rain-fed civilization. It does not arrive as one disaster. It arrives as 10,000 private ones. And the damage does not stop at the fence line, because the East's rivers are living systems, and right now they are running on empty. Stream flow gauges across the Carolinas and Georgia have spent months recording flows in the lowest percentiles ever measured for the date. And a shrunken river in a southern summer is a river in crisis. Shallow water heats fast under a July sun, and warm water holds less oxygen, which is why deep droughts in the South so often announce themselves with fish kills still pools turning belly-up silver in the space of an afternoon. The prized cold water trout streams of the southern Appalachians, already the southernmost outposts of a fish built for mountain chill, retreat pool by pool as their margins go warm and dry. Mussels, the quiet filter feeders that keep southern rivers clean and rank among the most endangered creatures on the continent, cannot flee at all, and a drought like this can erase populations that took centuries to establish. Then the crisis rides the rivers all the way to the sea, where it plays one of drought's strangest tricks. A healthy coastal river pushes a constant wall of fresh water out against the ocean, and that invisible pressure is what holds the salt back. When the flow collapses, the ocean advances, and a wedge of seawater creeps quietly upstream, miles farther than it has any historical right to be, sliding toward the intakes where coastal towns draw their drinking water and transforming the chemistry of the estuaries where oysters, shrimp, crabs, and most of the Atlantic seaboard's seafood begin their lives. Fishermen and oystermen feel a drought they can see no sign of in the sky, delivered to them entirely by a river that stopped pushing back. And scattered across this same drying map are the crops that give the region its identity, the ones that never make the commodity reports, but define entire local economies. Georgia's blueberry barrens and famous orchards, the peach stands of the Carolina Ridge, the pecan groves, the Fraser Fir Christmas tree farms terraced across North Carolina mountainsides, the sod farms and plant nurseries that landscape half the East Coast. Many of these are perennial crops, trees and bushes representing a decade or more of investment before they earn their first dollar. And a single brutal year can stress or kill plantings that no insurance check truly replaces, because you cannot buy back the 10 years it takes to grow a bearing orchard. Timber, the great quiet industry of the coastal plain, faces its own slow-motion version. Millions of acres of planted pine standing drought, stressed and increasingly vulnerable. To the bark beetles that specialize in finishing what dry years start, entire future harvests, and the mills and paychecks depending on them, weakening ring by ring. This is what makes an eastern drought so insidious compared to a storm. A hurricane takes its toll in one violent night and lets the counting begin. A drought like this one runs a silent tax on everything alive across 12 states simultaneously. The rivers, the reefs, the orchards, the forests, the herds, and it compounds daily with no landfall, no shelter, and no clear morning after when anyone can say it is over. And then there's the fire, because the East is discovering something the West has always known, and the East had the luxury of forgetting. Fire does not care how much rain a place gets in a normal year. Fire only cares how dry the fuel is today. The southeastern coastal plain is, in a sense, a fire landscape in disguise. Endless stands of pine, thickets of palmetto and gallberry loaded with volatile resins, and deep organic soils in its swamps and puckaisons, peat-like layers of ancient compressed vegetation. In a normal year, the water table keeps all of it too wet to matter. In a year like this one, the disguise comes off. The pines stand in cured brush that burns like it was engineered to, and the organic soils do something far worse, because when drought drops the water table and the peat itself dries, a fire can burrow into the ground and smolder there for weeks or months, immune to rain showers, immune to fire lines, exhaling smoke across entire regions and flaring back to life with every wind. Eastern North Carolina and Florida have seen such ground fires burn stubbornly through past droughts, and this year the warning lights are on again with fire potential. Elevated across a parched South Florida, and burn bans spreading through the Carolinas and Georgia, where officials now warn that a single spark from an ordinary backyard burn can outrun its owner in minutes. If that still sounds abstract, if some part of you still believes green country cannot produce a true catastrophe, then there is one November night you need to know about. There is a county in the deep pine country of southeastern Georgia where, until this year, the word drought was something people heard on the news about California. Brantley County sits in one of the wettest corners of the United States, a place of swamps and slash pine and 50 inches of rain in a normal year, a place where the ground squelches and the air itself feels like water. And this spring, Brantley County did two things no one alive there had ever seen. First, it became the first county in the entire Southeast to fall into exceptional drought, the highest and rarest category the federal drought monitor can assign, the designation reserved for the driest deserts in the worst years. And then it burned. A wildfire raced along the Highway 82 corridor through timber and brush that should have been too damp to carry flame. And by the time crews stopped it, at least 54 structures, homes, barns, the accumulated lives of families were gone. Ash in swamp country. Now pull the camera back because Brantley County is not an anomaly. It is a preview. Across the eastern United States right now in July of 2026, the driest stretch ever measured in more than 130 years of records has turned an entire green half of the country into something its own residents no longer recognize. Pastures, the color of August wheat in early spring. Cattle herds sold off at auction because there's nothing left for them to eat. Private wells coughing air in counties that have never known a well to fail. Fire danger warnings in Florida wetlands. Water restrictions in cities from Raleigh to the Carolina coast, where two more counties just crossed into that same exceptional category that Brantley reached first. And hanging over all of it, a forecast with a twist so cruel it sounds invented. The one force that reliably ends great eastern droughts, the tropical storm season, is now itself being suppressed by the shifting Pacific, which means the rescue this region is waiting for may simply never show up this year. Scientists have a name for what is happening to the east, and it is not just drought. It is a fundamentally new kind of drought, faster, hotter, and hungrier than the ones the region's entire way of life was built to survive. This is the story of what it is doing to the land, the farms, and the people standing on it, and why the Green East is learning in real time that green is not the same thing as safe. If deep, honest investigations into real threats are what you come here for, subscribe right now, because we go this far into the real science every single week. To understand why this drought behaves differently, you need to meet a concept that has quietly become one of the most important ideas in modern climate science. It is called evaporative demand, though researchers have a more vivid phrase for it: atmospheric thirst. Think of the atmosphere over any landscape as a giant, invisible sponge pressed down against the ground, constantly wicking moisture upward, out of the soil, out of leaves, out of ponds and puddles and the needles of every pine tree. How hard that. Sponge pulls depends overwhelmingly on temperature, and the relationship is not gentle. As air warms, its capacity to absorb water climbs steeply, which means every degree of warming makes the sponge thirstier. Now here is the crucial part. The southeast of 2026 is measurably warmer than the southeast of the last great droughts, which means that when the rains failed this time, from September of 2025 through the spring, delivering the driest such period Georgia and the Carolinas have recorded since 1895, the missing rain was only half the assault. The other half was the sky itself, actively strip-mining moisture out of the landscape at a rate the old droughts never matched. Scientists call the result a flash drought, and the name is earned. Where the iconic droughts of history took years to strangle a region, a flash drought can take a green, functioning landscape and drive it into agricultural crisis in 4 to 8 weeks. Faster than farmers can adapt, faster than water managers can respond, sometimes faster than the official drought maps can even update. The East watched a small-scale rehearsal in the autumn of 2024, when a flash drought dried the Northeast so abruptly that brush fires burned in the parks of New York City, and a November wildfire in New Jersey turned deadly, in a region where November wildfires were essentially a contradiction in terms. What is happening now is that same physics, scaled up to a dozen states and sustained for a year. That is the difference in this drought's DNA. It is not merely an absence of rain, it is an absence of rain multiplied by a presence of heat, and that multiplication is new. Now come down from the physics to the ground, to the people this is actually happening to, because the first and hardest hit are the ones whose livelihoods are wired directly to the sky. Here's a fact about Eastern agriculture that most Americans have never had a reason to learn. Unlike the great irrigated farm empires of the West, plumbed with canals and center pivots precisely because rain there was never trusted, an enormous share of the farmland east of the Mississippi runs on rainfall alone. No irrigation rig, no water right, no backup. For 300 years, that was not a gamble. It was simply how farming worked in a place where the sky delivered 4 inches a month like a subscription. This year, the subscription lapsed.